Up in flames. Arson destroys gay activist site, the New York Times reported. The site was an old firehouse on 99 Wooster Street in Soho, which had been turned into the headquarters of the Gay Activist Alliance. This was in 1974, just 5 years after the Stonewall Rebellion, and revolution was still in the air. The GAA adopted the letter lambda as its symbol and opened the firehouse to all. They held meetings there and dances. I wasn't a GAA member, but I went to a few meetings and dances just to see what was going on. The meetings were rambunctious, with lots of shouting and calls for order, as the gay men and lesbians worked out their revolutionary theory and practice. But it was the dances that paid the rent. At that time, there was no dancing at any of the gay bars in New York. The GAA dances were wild, joyous, exuberant, unlike anything I had ever seen. And then someone torched the firehouse. The fire broke out in the small hours the morning of a Tuesday in October. The offices on the third floor were completely burned out. On the second floor, firefighters found an empty bottle of wood alcohol, 3 half-full cans of charcoal lighter fluid, and a book of matches fitted with a fuse. Morty Manford, one of the founders of the Gay Activist Alliance, speculated that the attacks might have been part of the recent hate wave, like the firebombings of gay churches that had been happening around the country. Arthur Bell, who covered the gay beat for the Village Voice, mentioned the mafia as a possible suspect, but he didn't think it was likely. Instead, he suggested it might have been an inside job motivated by feuds and factions within the organization. It could have been any one of 6 different things, he told the Times. No arrests were ever made. The arsonists were never identified. Now in this clip, we will take a look at some possible suspects, maybe the ones Morty and Arthur had in mind, and you can be the detective. Did the haters burn down the firehouse? In those years, terrorists firebombed black churches all the time, especially in the South, and they firebombed gay churches too. Just a year earlier, in 1973, arsonists completely destroyed the Los Angeles headquarters of the Metropolitan Community Church. And then arsonists burned the Metropolitan Community Church in Nashville to the ground. No lives were lost in those fires, but 32 people died and 15 were injured in the arson attack on the Upstairs Lounge in New Orleans. The Upstairs Lounge was a gay bar, but it also was where the Metropolitan Community Church met on Sundays. No arrests were made in any of those cases. So was it the haters doing a hate crime? Probably not. The firehouse was in Soho, not in terrorist-friendly Nashville or New Orleans. And there weren't any threats, no follow-up, no one took credit, and there were no similar hate firebombings in New York. It was a one-time only event. Did the mob whack the firehouse? Everyone knew the gay bars in New York were run by the mafia. Greenwich Village was the turf of the Vito Genovese crime family. Vito himself died in prison shortly before the Stonewall riots, and he was succeeded by Tommy Ryan Eberly, who happened to be the owner of 2 gay bars. However, in 1972, while sitting in his chauffeured Cadillac, Tommy Ryan Eberly was shot 5 times and died instantly, and the Genovese family was left without a leader. The succession crisis was still going on 2 years later when the firehouse burned. Still, the mobsters were arson experts, definitely capable of breaking in and setting a building on fire. So did the gangsters do it to eliminate competition? Probably not. The mafia was already getting out of the gay bar business. They were good businessmen, and they could tell that gay bars were not a growth industry for their business model. The growing spirit of tolerance was wrecking it. As early as 1967, 3 years before the Stonewall riots, the mobsters were already selling off their gay clubs. And anyway, the firehouse dances did not, in fact, hurt the gay bars and baths, which were doing just fine. Did the Gay Liberation Front torch the firehouse to eliminate a rival activist group? The Gay Liberation Front formed right after the Stonewall riots. The name signaled kinship with other revolutionary struggles, such as the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. It was a way of saying that gay people were demanding their own revolution. However, the Gay Liberation Front was mostly vibes. It was so disorganized you could hardly call it an organization at all. But what it lacked in structure, it made up in energy, and it spun off a raft of more focused groups. There was a lesbian caucus. There was a drag queen caucus. There was a youth caucus. There was a third world caucus. And there was a moderate caucus, which became the Gay Activist Alliance. Ever since the French Revolution, there had been splits between the radicals, who wanted to destroy the old order, and the assimilationists, who wanted to work within it. The gay movement saw that in the 1950s, when the moderates ousted the communists from Mattachine and rewrote its constitution, declaring that Mattachine did not seek to overthrow the government. Look how respectably the protesters of that era were dressed. After the Stonewall riots, Mattachine even issued a plea for peace and quiet, but the Gay Liberation Front was not interested in peace and quiet. So did the Gay Liberation people torch the firehouse in order to put the moderate Gay Activist Alliance out of business? Probably not. The Gay Liberation Front was more about venting feelings than getting things done. It did not really have the executive ability to organize a firebombing. Did the Split and Wreck Party firebomb the firehouse in order to hasten the revolution? Over the years, a lot of organizations have used the name Socialist Workers' Party. There was one in the 70s that people sometimes called the Split and Wreck Party because it was rumored that they infiltrated leftist groups and stirred up internal factions and feuds. According to Marxist theory, capitalism contained within itself certain contradictions that were the seeds of its destruction. But if things got better, people would be less motivated to revolt. The split and wreck tactics were intended to sharpen the contradiction, the better to provoke a revolution. The Gay Activist Alliance was dedicated to working within the system and trying to make things better. And by this logic, they were counter-revolutionary. David Thorstad, one of the leaders of the Gay Activist Alliance, was a defector from the Socialist Workers' Party, and he had published criticism of its failure to develop a Marxist analysis of gay liberation. This might have invited retaliation. So did the Split and Wreck Party burn down the firehouse? Probably not. Whether they actually employed disruptive tactics, I do not know, and I don't expect that they would broadcast such a scheme if it existed. But an arson attack would be very different from just stirring up quarrels at meetings. Did the lesbians burn down the firehouse? The Lesbian Feminist Liberation was the last group ever to meet there. They finished up and locked the doors around 10 o'clock Monday night. The fire broke out about 3:30 the next morning. The lesbians were having a difficult revolution. Right after Stonewall, the women organized as the Gay Liberation Front Lesbians. Then they broke away and formed their own group, the Radical Lesbians, but before long, the Radical Lesbians dissolved. Then when the Gay Activist Alliance took off, the lesbians joined and formed the GAA Lesbian Committee. But they wanted more focus on women's issues, so they joined up with their sisters in the feminist movement. However, they were not welcome. Betty Friedan denounced them as the Lavender Menace. The lesbians were on their own. At about that time, the ex-nun Jean O'Leary stepped up and led the lesbians in a break from the GAA and the formation of a new organization called the Lesbian Feminist Liberation. So did the Lesbian Feminist Liberation burn the firehouse down to get even? Probably not. Despite the split, the Lesbian Feminist Liberation was still closely allied with the Gay Activist Alliance, and was still holding its meetings in the firehouse. It would hardly want to burn its own meeting place down. Did the drag queens do it? The drag brigade was STAR, standing for Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. This was basically Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. That's Marsha on the left and Sylvia holding up one side of the banner. Marsha and Sylvia were tough. Marsha, it was said, could swing her purse like a club, and she kept a couple of bricks in it. Sometimes she slipped out of character and turned into Malcolm, an angry man looking for fights, and then she would wind up in the hospital sedated and emerge to be Marsha again. Like the Lesbians, the Queens were having a difficult revolution, and it all ended up in a big fight at the 1973 Christopher Street Liberation Day March. The Lesbians objected to having a drag performance, and Jean O'Leary gave a speech about how men exploited women, and Sylvia Rivera stormed the stage and took the microphone and led a chant for gay power, and Bette Midler had to calm the crowd. So the drag queens were pissed off and impulsive. Did they burn down the firehouse? Probably not. Marsha and Sylvia were very beloved in the movement. Here is Marsha teaching the crowd some moves at a firehouse dance. They both had really hard lives, but are remembered with love and gratitude. Here is the bust of Marsha Johnson at the Gay Liberation Monument in Sheridan Square. Here is Hudson Street being renamed Sylvia Rivera Way. The CUNY Center for Gay Studies every year grants the Sylvia Rivera Award in Transgender Studies. And then there is the Marsha P. Johnson State Park, 11 green acres on the East River in Williamsburg. So, who torched the firehouse? The Lesbians locked up about 10 o'clock Monday night. An artist whose studio was just across the street told investigators that he had seen 2 cars zoom away from the firehouse entrance about 2:45 Tuesday morning. Who was it? Well, here's all the suspects I can think of. The haters, the mafia, the Gay Liberation Front, the Split and Wreck Party, the Lesbians, the drag queens. And I rate them all as probably not. If you can think of any clues I have missed or suspects I have left out, please share them in the comments.